Pueblo, Colorado, a city forgotten. The streets stretched out, empty and cold. Buildings stood huddled against the winter wind, their windows dark, lifeless eyes staring out. Snow fell, a relentless silent shroud. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the snowdrifts in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The light faded quickly, leaving behind a cold, unsettling twilight. This was Pueblo in winter. Dan Miller gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. The old Ford rumbled through the deserted streets, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. He had come to Pueblo for a fresh start, to outrun the ghosts of his past. Beside him, Laura stared out the window, her face pale and drawn. She clutched a worn photograph in her gloved hand, her knuckles white. It was a picture of their daughter, Emma. In the back seat, Emma sat hunched over her phone, the screen casting an eerie glow on her pale face. At 16, she was already a master at disconnecting, at building walls to keep the world at bay. The Millers were a family fractured, held together by threads of love and obligation, frayed by hardship and disappointment. They had come to Pueblo seeking refuge, a place to start over. The diner was a beacon of warmth and light in the gathering darkness. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and fried food, a comforting aroma that did little to dispel the unease that had settled over the Millers. They sat in a booth by the window, the falling snow a silent backdrop to their strained silence. Dan felt a shiver run down his spine, a coldness that seemed to seep into his bones. He glanced at Laura, saw the same look of unease in her eyes. Even Emma, lost in her digital world, seemed to feel it. The Millers huddled together in the booth, a fragile unit against the encroaching darkness. Outside, the snow fell harder, obscuring the streetlights, turning the familiar into something alien and threatening. Emma, finally putting down her phone, stared out the window, her gaze fixed on something in the swirling snow. The diner felt like the last outpost of civilization, a tiny island of light in a sea of swirling snow and encroaching darkness. The old diner clock ticked away the minutes, each one a hammer blow against the silence that had fallen over the Miller's booth. Dan stared blankly at the salt and pepper shakers, their mundane forms offering no solace from the growing unease in the pit of his stomach. Emma, her phone momentarily forgotten, shifted in her seat, her gaze drawn to the swirling snow beyond the window. A tall, slender figure, its edges blurring into the storm, its presence more felt than seen. A sudden clatter from the diner's kitchen broke the silence, causing Dan to flinch visibly and Laura to grip the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. The other occupants of the diner, a handful of locals seeking refuge from the storm, seemed oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, their conversations continuing unabated. The hum that Dan had first noticed seemed to intensify, vibrating through the floorboards, resonating in his teeth. Emma, her gaze still fixed on the window, felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. The feeling that something was watching, a sensation she had initially dismissed as paranoia, intensified, wrapping around her like the icy tendrils of the blizzard outside. The world outside the diner window seemed to warp and distort, the falling snow taking on unnatural patterns, the shadows lengthening, reaching out towards the diner like grasping claws. Dan, his unease growing with every passing moment, reached for his coffee, his hand trembling slightly. He took a sip, the bitter liquid doing little to soothe his raw nerves. The hum intensified, a throbbing pulse that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, vibrating through the soles of their feet, crawling up their legs. "We need to go," Dan muttered, his voice tight with the tension that belied his attempt at casualness. The old Ford crunched through the snow, its headlights cutting a path through the swirling white. Dan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles bone white, his gaze darting from the road to the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see something monstrous emerge from the blizzard. Beside him, Laura sat stiffly, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her breath shallow and quick. The miller's house loomed before them, a dark silhouette against the snow-covered landscape. Dan parked the car in the driveway, the engine sputtering into silence. Dan turned off the ignition. The silence that followed broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the frantic beating of his own heart. The hum, which had faded slightly during the drive, returned with a vengeance, vibrating through the car, seeming to emanate from the very ground beneath them. "Let's get inside," Dan said, his voice raspy, strained. Emma remained silent, her gaze distant, her attention seemingly fixed on something beyond their perception. The air inside the house was stale and cold, heavy with the weight of secrets and the lingering scent of decay. Dan fumbled for the light switch, but the bulb flickered weakly before dying completely, plunging them into darkness. He cursed under his breath, his hand trembling as he reached for his lighter. Carved into the hardwood floor, a perfect spiral, glowing faintly with the same sickly yellow light that emanated from the second-story window. Panic surged through Dan, a primal fear that tightened his throat, making it difficult to breathe. He stumbled back, bumping into Laura, who gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Emma stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the glowing spiral, her eyes wide and unblinking. "We need to get out of here," Dan choked out, his voice tight with terror. "The town had them now." Dan stared at the spiral etched into the floorboards, its sickly yellow glow seeming to pulse with a life of its own. It wasn't just a marking, he realized with a growing sense of dread. It was a wound, a gaping maw that threatened to swallow them whole. The hum resonated from its depths, a discordant symphony of whispers and groans that seemed to claw at the edges of his sanity. He dropped to his knees, running his fingers over the rough edges of the spiral, feeling the unnatural heat that emanated from its core. It was as if the house itself was bleeding, the lifeblood of the structure seeping out through this grotesque wound. He looked up at Laura, saw the terror etched on her face, a mirror to his own growing despair. "What is this place?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered, unanswerable. They had come to Pueblo seeking a fresh start, a refuge from the storms of their past. But this town, this house, offered no sanctuary. It was a place of shadows and whispers, a place where the very ground beneath their feet seemed to throb with a malevolent energy. Dan scrambled to his feet, his mind racing, grasping for some solution, some way out of this nightmare. He grabbed a bucket of soapy water, a scrub brush, anything to erase the mark, to sever the connection he felt in his gut between the spiral and the growing terror that threatened to consume him. He scrubbed furiously, the bristles of the brush scraping against the wood, but the spiral remained, its glow intensifying with each frantic pass. Laura, her face pale and drawn, held Emma close, her voice a low, soothing murmur against the rising tide of panic. Emma, her eyes fixed on the spiral, seemed strangely detached, her expression a mixture of fear and fascination. The mark on her hand, once faint, now pulsed with a life of its own, a dark mirror to the one etched into the floorboards. "It's no use, Dan," Laura said, her voice weary, resigned. "We can't fight this. We have to get out of here." But even as she spoke, she knew the futility of her words. The town had them now, had sunk its claws deep into their souls. There would be no escaping its grasp. The hum intensified, vibrating through the very foundations of the house, a constant, throbbing presence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows lengthening, twisting, taking on the shapes of monstrous creatures that watched them with cold, unblinking eyes. Dan raced from window to window, testing locks, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs. But every exit was barred, every avenue of escape sealed shut, as if by some unseen hand. The house had become a cage, a prison of their own making. Outside, the storm raged, the wind howling like a banshee, the snow swirling into a blinding whiteout. But even through the fury of the blizzard, Dan could sense the town watching, its dark windows like the eyes of 1,000 predators, its silence more menacing than any scream. Emma, her hand throbbing in sync with the pulsing light emanating from the spiral on the floor, took a step towards the centre of the room. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to glow with an unnatural light, her body moving with a puppet-like grace that sent chills down Dan's spine. "Emma, no!" Laura cried, reaching out for her daughter, but Dan pulled her back, his grip on her arm tight, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Don't touch her. I think it's got her." He didn't know what it was, but he felt its presence now. A palpable entity woven into the very fabric of the house, of the town, of their own terror. Emma turned, her face illuminated by the pulsing light of the spiral, a serene smile playing on her lips. "It's okay," she said, her voice strangely calm, echoing with a resonance that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "It wants to show us something. It wants to take us home." The word home hung in the air, heavy with a sinister implication that chilled Dan to the bone. This house, this town, this presence, it was not their home. It was something else entirely, something ancient and monstrous, and it was drawing them towards it with the inexorable pull of a whirlpool. He looked at Laura, saw the same dawning realization in her eyes, the same terror mixed with a strange sense of inevitability. They were caught in a current far stronger than themselves, swept along by a force they could neither understand nor resist. And then, as if in answer to his unspoken question, the spiral on the floor pulsed brighter, the hum intensifying into a deafening roar. The air crackled with energy, the shadows on the walls twisting and contorting, resolving into a single terrifying image, a gaping maw of darkness at the edge of town, the entrance to the abandoned mine, beckoning them forward into the hungry heart of the earth. The mine entrance loomed before them, a jagged maw in the earth's skin. Snow swirled around its edges, sucked inward as if by a giant unseen breath. The air hung heavy, thick with the metallic tang of minerals and the stench of decay. Dan's flashlight beam, a feeble finger of light in the overwhelming darkness, trembled in his grip. The hum, once a low drone, now throbbed in their chests, a physical pressure against their bones. It resonated off the mine walls, amplified by the darkness, a chorus of whispers urging them forward, deeper into the earth's cold embrace. This was no place for the living. This was a place of shadows and echoes, a place where light dared not tread. Laura clutched Emma's hand, her grip tight, a lifeline in the encroaching darkness. Emma, her eyes still glazed with that unsettling serenity, didn't resist. She walked towards the gaping maw of the mine, drawn by an unseen force, a puppet dancing to a tune only she could hear. Dan, his heart a drumbeat of dread against his ribs, followed. There was no other choice. The spiral path had led them here. Section 2. The darkness breathes. The air inside the mine was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, something ancient and unnameable. Dan's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rough-hewn tunnels, the walls slick with moisture, glistening like the scales of some monstrous serpent. The air hung heavy, pregnant with a silence that was somehow louder than any scream. They walked deeper into the mine, each step a descent into a nightmare. The spiral motif was everywhere, etched into the rock, carved into the wooden supports, a recurring nightmare etched into the very fabric of the mine. The air grew colder, the darkness more profound, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Dan's hand shook, the flashlight beam dancing erratically, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe and contort like living things. His breath came in ragged gasps, the air thick and oppressive, suffocating him. He felt a presence here, something vast and ancient watching them from the darkness, its cold, unblinking gaze piercing the thin veil of his sanity. Section 3. Echoes of Terror, Whispers of Truth. The tunnel opened into a cavern, its vastness swallowing the meagre light of their flashlights. The air here was thick with the dust of ages, the silence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water seeping from the cavern ceiling. Each drop an echo of forgotten time. The walls were a tapestry of spirals, some small and precise, others massive, spanning the entire height of the cavern, their edges disappearing into the impenetrable darkness above. "This place, it's wrong," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her own heart. The hum resonated throughout the cavern, a low, throbbing pulse that seemed to emanate from the very rock itself. She could feel it in her teeth, in her bones, vibrating through her very being. Dan shone his flashlight across the cavern floor, his blood running cold at what he saw. Scattered across the rock were bones, human bones, picked clean and bleached white by time. Some were ancient, little more than dust and fragments, others more recent, still bearing the tattered remnants of clothing, the silent testament to the mine's insatiable hunger. Section 4. Consumed by the Hollow. A blood-curdling scream tore through the silence, echoing off the cavern walls. Dan whirled around, his heart in his throat, to see Laura backing away from something he couldn't quite make out in the darkness. Her eyes were wide with terror, her face pale as death. Emma stood beside her, still eerily calm, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the reach of Dan's flashlight beam. "What is it? What do you see?" Dan cried, his voice raw with panic. He stumbled towards them, his foot catching on something hard and unforgiving. He went down with a cry, the flashlight flying from his grasp, its beam dancing wildly before disappearing into the darkness. A wave of cold washed over him, a coldness that seemed to seep into his bones, into his very soul. He felt a presence above him, something vast and impossibly ancient, its essence woven into the very fabric of the mine. He tried to cry out, but no sound escaped his lips. He was falling, he realized, but not down. He was falling inward into the heart of the darkness, consumed by the hollow beneath. Laura scrambled back, pulling Emma along with her, her mind reeling from the horror of what she had seen. A fleeting glimpse of something monstrous, its form shifting and writhing in the darkness, its eyes burning with a cold, inhuman intelligence. But even as she ran, she knew it was futile. The cavern had them now, swallowed them whole. She stumbled and fell, her hand scraping against the rough rock floor. She looked down and saw, with a sickening lurch in her gut, that her hand was covered in a black, viscous liquid, the same substance that oozed from the spirals on the cavern walls. It pulsed, faintly warm against her skin, and she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her, a seductive numbness that spread through her limbs, stealing her fear, her will, her very self. She looked up at Emma, saw that her daughter's eyes were now completely black, reflecting the swirling vortex of darkness that seemed to open up above them, a gateway to some unimaginable abyss. And in that moment, Laura understood this was the true face of the hollow, the void that lay beneath the surface of their reality. It was not a place, not a thing. but an absence, a hunger that could never be sated, a darkness that consumed all light, all hope, all life. And they were falling into it together, mother and daughter, their screams swallowed by the silence, their very beings dissolving into the nothingness that awaited them. The cavern pulsed with a sickly yellow light, emanating from the countless spirals that adorned its walls. The air hung heavy, thick with the dust of ages and the lingering echoes of terror, but the screams were gone, swallowed by the vastness of the space, absorbed by the silence that settled like a shroud. Laura was gone. Dan was gone. Emma, her eyes now vacant black pools reflecting the cavern's depths, stood alone at the edge of the abyss. The spiral on her hand, once a mark of terror, now pulsed with a cold, serene light, a beacon in the consuming darkness. The cavern was silent, yet it spoke. It whispered of forgotten ages, of ancient powers that slumbered beneath the earth, of a hunger that could never be sated. It spoke through the spirals that adorned its walls, through the echoes of screams that lingered in the air, through the very absence of life that permeated the space. Pueblo, once a town teetering on the edge of oblivion, now stood poised on the precipice of true nothingness. The Millers were gone, vanished without a trace, their story another dark chapter in the town's long history of sorrow. Their house stood empty, a silent monument to the darkness that had swallowed them whole. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the town in a pristine white shroud, a stark contrast to the darkness that festered beneath its surface. The wind moaned through the empty streets, carrying with it the whispers of the lost, their voices faint but insistent, a chorus of sorrow echoing through the years. The diner at the edge of town, once a haven of warmth and light, now stood dark and deserted, its windows boarded up, its neon sign extinguished. The clock inside, frozen at the moment the Millers had first felt the town's chilling embrace, served as a grim reminder of the passage of time, a testament to the ephemeral nature of life in the face of the eternal hunger that lurked below. Weeks later, a lone car broke through the silence, its headlights cutting through the snow-covered landscape like knives. Sarah, her face etched with a mixture of determination and grief, pulled up to the curb in front of the Miller's house, her gaze drawn to the darkened windows, the overgrown lawn, the air of abandonment that clung to the place like a shroud. She had come to Pueblo seeking answers, drawn by a vague sense of duty, a need to understand what had happened to her distant relatives, to make sense of their sudden, inexplicable disappearance. She had received a postcard from Laura just days before they vanished, a cheerful message that spoke of new beginnings, of hope for the future. And then, silence. As she stepped out of the car, the air seemed to grow colder, the silence pressing in on her, heavy and oppressive. She felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine, a sense of being watched, of being judged by unseen eyes. She shook off the feeling, attributing it to the grief, the isolation, the sheer strangeness of this place. But deep down, a primal fear stirred. A voice whispered a warning she couldn't quite grasp. She walked towards the house, her footsteps crunching on the snow-covered path. As she reached the porch, her gaze fell on a small silver object half buried in the snowdrifts. She bent down and picked it up, brushing away the snow to reveal a delicate locket, its surface tarnished with age. It was Laura's locket, she realized, a family heirloom passed down through generations, but as she turned it over in her hands, her blood ran cold. Etched into the silver, barely visible to the naked eye, was a spiral, its form identical to the one described in the newspaper articles she had devoured on her journey. The articles that spoke of the Millers' disappearance, the articles that dismissed it as another tragic case of a family succumbing to the harsh realities of life on the edge of the world. A gust of wind swirled around her, carrying with it a whisper, a single word uttered in a voice both ancient and infinitely vast: below. The locket pulsed faintly in her hand, its spiral glowing with an eerie light. And Sarah knew with a certainty that defied logic that the answer she sought lay not in the empty house behind her, but in the darkness that awaited below. The spiral path had chosen its next traveller,